Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, BS listeners, and welcome back to the show. Today, I am very excited to welcome George Kohlrieser. George is an organizational and clinical psychologist. He's also Distinguished Professor of Leadership and Organizational Behavior at IMD and consultant to several global companies, including Accenture, Amer Sports, Borealis, Cisco, Coca-Cola, HB, Hitachi, IBM, IFC, Morgan Stanley, Motorola, NASA, Nestlé, among many, many others. His research, teaching, and consulting activities are focused on high-performance leadership, high-performance teamwork, conflict management, change management, dialogue and negotiation, coaching, stress management, work-life balance, and personal and professional development. He is also a police psychologist and hostage negotiator, focusing on aggression management and hostage negotiations. George is director of the High Performance Leadership Program, which is an intense 6-day IMD program for experienced senior leaders. He is the author of the international bestselling book, Hostage at the Table: How Leaders Can Overcome Conflict, Influence Others, and Raise Performance. His second book, Care to Dare, Unleashing Astonishing Potential Through Secure-Based Leadership, has been nominated one of the best business books of 2013 by Soundview. George, welcome to the show. So we could start at any, I feel like, number of interesting jump-off points as they relate to your work as a researcher, educator, practitioner, consultant, coach. Perhaps, though, it makes most sense to take a look at how you got here with such an interesting and fascinating career. By my record, it is a really intriguing story. So do you mind walking listeners through it? Who is George and how did you get here?
Thanks, Nick. And first of all, I'm very happy to be here with you today and with your listeners as well. So I'm basically an old farm boy growing up in the U.S., and I'm supposed to be planting seeds and growing crops, but my life turned out very different. So I spent 10 years in a Catholic seminary from 10 to 22 and left after 10 years. And then I moved into the whole arena of psychology, understanding how people are motivated, dealing with primarily violence and mediation. And that took me into the whole arena of conflict management and being able to understand how to bring people together. Along the way, I became a hostage negotiator in dealing with domestic violence, having been held hostage 4 times myself, which I don't think was exactly stupid, but it was risk taking. I was part of domestic violence. And then eventually I moved into the area of psychology and psychotherapy, and from there into conflict management within organizations. And that journey took me to where I'm at now, which is primarily focused on leadership, because I see leadership as such a key to bringing so many good things into the world, personal, professional, organizational, that I want to help develop leaders to be the best leaders that they can be. So that's the short version.
That's a very short version indeed, and there's some things there that I feel we just have to dive into. Not least of which is what you said was that you were taken hostage. Was it 4 times?
4 times, yeah. This
Wow.
it sounds stupid, doesn't it?
I think I think it's safe to say you're the first guest on the show who's been taken hostage, not once, but four
More than
times.
once.
Yeah.
No, I was doing domestic violence intervention. This was in the early 70s when there was a real movement in law enforcement for community policing and being able to de escalate violence and conflict. And so this meant domestic violence was at the forefront. So I would
Mm.
go into homes with police officers, and where people agreed, after things were calmed down, I would engage in mediation behavior and then follow up. And on one occasion, I was with the police when a very psychotic man at a local hospital took a nurse. The lieutenant who was in charge noticed quickly that we were in a hospital, obviously, and we could not use kicking in the door or tear gas. So he asked me if I would go in and talk this psychotic man down. In the process, he stabbed Sheila in the neck, cutting her throat, ended up putting the knife at my throat. And thank God, through the power of dialogue, the power of words, he surrendered. He came out voluntarily and cooperatively. And I learned something very important from that, Nick, that words are more powerful than guns, and that you can change people's minds quite well, challenging, but you can do it effectively. So that was one of the first times. The other were in homes where people had weapons hidden, or once in my office where someone pulled a gun out on me as I was dealing with very violent behavior.
Wow.
But I survived them all.
Look, well, that's amazing. What city
In
were
Dayton,
those in?
Ohio.
In
Dayton, Ohio. So it's not an unusually violent city, but you remember we were in a time, and it's pretty much basically the same now. 35% of all homicides in most communities in the United States occur in families or with
Mhm.
people who know one another. So if you get in early enough, you can prevent the homicide rate, which we eventually did. And
Mm.
unfortunately, that whole community policing idea got lost as police forces were moved towards a more militaristic approach.
And I want to touch on that because that was one of my sort of points as you were walking through this story. But what I just a separate point that I want to throw out there is I just finished. I just recapped the first year of the show, and I ask all the same question to my guests at the end, which is this big behavioral brainstorm, and it's what are all the issues in society right now that we as behavioral scientists and psychologists can help solve for, and a lot of people had the same answers, which is climate change and conflict, and one of those categories was also poverty and inequality and lack of fairness. And Michael Sanders, who was, I think it was like, this was like episode 2, the second episode, he actually pointed to some really new research that I think is not even sort of out yet on these modern style interventions for domestic violence. Because he was saying it sort of is the foundation of a lot of inequalities in society and in culture. And if you can sort of solve that chief variable, which is domestic violence, then maybe there's others knockoff effects that can take care of themselves down the line. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I absolutely agree. And it's not just domestic violence, it's dealing with mentally ill people, people who
Mm-hmm.
are having a lot of emotional difficulties. And police were trained at one point, and we have the model, Nick, for de escalation, community policing. I lived it for 3 years, I saw it work. And
Hmm.
then there was a gradual drifting away. Police used to be taught, at least some police officers, how to talk somebody down and not just automatically start thinking weapons or control. And what I learned from hostage negotiation may be interesting to your listeners. There are 3 steps. One is to, first of all, connect. The basic thing is, how do you form a bond with somebody you don't like, an enemy, a dangerous person? How do you then understand the motivation? Happy people don't take hostages. At least I've never seen them. There's always a grievance, there's a loss. And I came to understand something very important, which is grief and the role grief has in all its forms in creating violence. And then, third, is making concessions. And through that process, the hostage negotiator, once entering the situation, talks down the hostage taker to give up their weapons, give up their hostages, come out knowing full well they're going to go to prison. What do you think was the success rate as measured both by FBI in Quantico and Interpol here in Europe? What do you think the success rate of hostage negotiators is?
Coming out saying like on their own will, no heart, like no violence.
Yeah,
Oh gosh, I'm gonna be conservative and say 20 25%.
you're going to be shocked. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
95% success rate.
Wow.
The art, and this is documented. I mean, goes back to when they started measuring from the 70s. The art and science of hostage negotiation is a very advanced form of leadership. First of all, leading yourself. Secondly, leading others, influencing others to change their mindset,
Hmm.
and also leading organizations. So when I had a scissors to my throat, and the guy who actually did it, I had to manage my own self, which is the fundamentals of leadership. How do you manage yourself? And then influencing him. And he voluntarily came out. And this is what hostage negotiators do. It doesn't work to tell them they have to come out. It doesn't work to make threats. What you do is get them to make a choice, and you give them a choice, and you understand the motivation. In Sam's case, he became psychotic over being stabbed by his ex wife, and I understood that he wanted to see his kids and he thought they didn't love him anymore because that's what she said. When he saw the benefit that he could still have a relationship with those kids, he was able to come out. The most dangerous hostage taker is the one who wants nothing, has
Hmm.
nothing to lose, and is ready to commit police suicide by doing something stupid to get the police to kill him. And
Hmm.
here's the thing, Nick. We don't have to have a weapon to our head or a knife to our throat to be a hostage. We can be a psychological hostage to other people, to situations, even to ourselves. So when people are filled with shame, guilt, regret, grief, you name the negative internal states people get into, also known as victimization,
Hmm.
they're psychological hostage. So, in a way, leadership is about freeing people from being psychological hostages.
Hmm.
Is that a
That's
nice way to look at it?
That's a great way to look at it. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it all stems back to these core set of like emotional and motivational properties and processes, namely, grief
Yeah,
and shame
yeah.
and in all the experience that you had, both in sort of like on the police side, but also in leadership and psychological hostage, if you will. Um, I mean, it's so very clinical. Is it always a sort of a complex affective emotional related experience that stems back years of their life and their development of family and relationships? Is it rooted in that?
I think some are very complex, some are quite simple.
Hmm.
We have to distinguish between the two. It could be an immediate situation, and what we know is that in their history, they don't have the foundations of psychological safety. So danger or threat or loss push them over into this state of not feeling um, safe, and so they move to a survival mode from the brain. And survival is either kill or be killed, to be reactive. So you have to be able to calm that down, understand what is driving their survival mode of behavior, and then talk them down. But
Hmm.
talking people down is quite simple once you understand the process. And by the way, this is the point leaders have to learn how to be able to talk to people, influence people without being domineering, bullying, bossing, and not tolerate underperforming behavior. We have so many organizations that tolerate underperformance,
Hmm.
and leaders are learning more and more how to be able to influence to bring the best out of employees. And this pandemic situation, the COVID virus, how many people are hostage to that? And the whole
Hmm.
world is grieving in a way. And many feel like a hostage and they're doing stupid things as part of that.
Yeah, and
I can see you're really thinking there.
well, the wheels are turning, that's for sure. I do want to go back to two things. First is that there was at this time this investment and this willingness to have this aspect of policing involved, which is like including professionals like yourselves in these high stakes situations. And it seems, well, you said, doesn't seem that they moved away from that, and
Yeah.
it's sort of more this focus on the militarization aspect of policing. What happened? Why is that the case? If we know it has such high effectiveness, rates of effectiveness, and it works, Why did we move away from it, and why now the focus on this super militarization part of policing?
Simple, Nick. Failure of leadership. Failure of leadership. The leaders could not see the value of de escalation methods. They saw the value of arming police. It was command and control. And so the police moved not to peacemakers and being able to interact in a community, but they became enforcers of the law. And the focus was on their being in control. And
Mm,
the worst thing was to lose control. And it's really, really a sad turn of events. And there are many police officers, as we saw with the Black Lives Movement, who would do things to build bonds. You see, people can't kill people, they kill objects, they kill things, the demonization process. And police officers, like the man who was the police officer put his knee on George Floyd's. George wasn't a person, he was a thing. It was an
mm,
object. And you see,
mm,
police officers can easily get into a system where they feel detached. It can happen with medicine, it can happen in organizations. How many leaders don't care anymore? And the moment any organization stops caring, we're in trouble.
mm, mm. And obviously this is a point that is top of mind for a lot of people right now with the Black Lives Matter movement and this whole sort of call for more on the Democrats and liberal side of defund the police, which I think is a very complex argument. But maybe it's not so much as, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Not so much as defund the police, but fund it in a different way to allow more for
There
these
you
things.
go. Defunding police is a dead end street. It's refocusing the training. It's bringing the forces back into understanding how to deal with people, that the police are part of a community and serve a community, and
Mm,
being able then to engage in these techniques of de escalation. And and that's why when you're asked the question, what is our most pressing behavioral science problem? I think it's psychological safety. I think it's
mm,
really the ability to help people feel safe in a dangerous, changing, uncertain world. And
mm,
through that safety, then you stop the survival mechanism, and then you can build this ability to talk to other people, to find ways to resolve conflict. But the fundamental thing is people have lost trust. People have lost a sense of safety, and that trust starts in our leaders, that we don't see them as being caring to us, being motivated more by power. Once
mm,
that psychological safety is in place and finding safety in times of danger and uncertainty, then we can start having conversations with people with different political opinions, different religious views, differences of all kinds. And you see so many people, and this is what hostage negotiators learn: one, how to ask questions; two, how to accept what you don't agree with. Many people cannot have a meaningful dialogue with people that they disagree with. You see, I can hear a disagreement. I don't have to agree with it. And I've heard all kind of garbage as a as a
I can
hostage
imagine.
negotiator. You hear all kind of stuff, but I don't have to say I don't agree with that. I focus on acceptance first.
Hmm. There's a really good paper that just came out, and I did a blog summary on it like 2 days ago, actually. And it was basically showing that if you take people who feel supported and loved by family members, partners, and even colleagues and organizations, then that person is more likely to come into a situation of conflicting views and opposing views with more open mind, and they're more willing to have like an ambivalent attitude, which is I can hold two things which are opposing in their view at once and be okay with it and be okay with that level of discomfort because I have that trust of psychological safety, even in an incidental way, not related to the situation outside that by a colleague who supports me or whatever it is.
Perfect, perfect. It's the whole idea of how you bond with an enemy, an adversary. And many people have never seen that in a family, have never seen people do that, so they don't have that model. If you grew up in a family where conflicts were sorted out, disagreements were accepted, then you have that model in your mind. What we have now is something else happening in the mindset of people, which is I'm either right or I'm wrong, and I won't admit that I'm wrong.
And with all the lunacy of American politics right now that's happening, what's your take of it if we apply a sort of this sort of frame and lens of the situation?
I think we need strong leadership to help build unity and the ability to create this sense that we're all together. We have to rebond, and we
Mm,
can't have people provoking negativity,
yeah.
distrust, fear. And we have too many people for political power who want to provoke fear. And when you provoke fear, it brings out the whole survival mechanism. We need, on the other hand, to be together if we're going to survive. And that's why all the other problems, climate warming and poverty and so forth, are dependent on people working together
Mm,
in the sense of creating safety.
yeah. And I think try and keep politics out of it here, but sometimes you
It's
just
impossible.
can't.
It's impossible, Nick.
It's impossible, especially these days. But you just basically had you sort of depicted one phrase, Trump and his behaviors, and
Yeah,
he is the antithesis of instilling psychological safety and trust. He did everything opposite of that. He did everything he could within his power to instill a lack of trust, to create this sort of emerging sensation that the world is dangerous, that certain people are dangerous. And I mean, it's classic sort of fascism 101 if you look back to sort of those authoritarian states, and it's just so obvious what he's doing, and now we're seeing the
the
effects of it
result.
downstream.
There's a concept in hostage negotiation theory called the Stockholm Syndrome, where the hostage forms a bond to the hostage taker. And Trump cleverly used fear as a way to get people to bond to him. He was going to save them. And it started in the upper Midwest.
Mm,
The farmers, the hard workers, the manual laborers felt really, really ignored. And he tapped into that. And it was grief that brought him the win in that election,
mm,
understanding the loss that was behind that. And even though he hasn't done that much to help them out, they still believe he's going to save them. And it's the whole idea that you look not for someone that you can collaborate with, but you look for a savior, you look for a great rescuer. And it ain't going to happen.
yeah.
But people don't realize that, or some
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
Some people, yeah, 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 yeah. Okay, so you've done a really great job of taking your past experiences and your past work of hostage being a hostage negotiator in these rather extreme and dangerous situations, and you've seen the psychological parallels between that and other, say, more less extreme, more
Yeah.
ordinary leadership and organizational in an organizational life. But it works because it all stems from the same sort of psychological basis. And you have this fairly recent piece in McKinsey, and I'm just going to start with what I think is the opening quote when you sort of pull open the piece, and it reads this: "The pandemic is fueling a wave of grief and loss that threatens to derail leaders and hurt organizations. Yet, when addressed, grief can be a creative force that turns loss into inspiration." So I know you've touched on it already, but can you elaborate a little bit of that and what else is in the piece? And I'll link to it in the show notes because it's a great one for sure.
Okay. Thank you. And here's the point: grief is natural. It happens in life. We have to be able to get over loss. And we have many people who are motivated by hidden grief. Organizations are filled following mergers and acquisitions, a
Mm,
failed project, a lost leader, thousands and thousands of little and big losses that provoke grief. Right here in Switzerland, the CEO of Swisscom, who went through a profound grief, but he didn't know how to name it. He
mm,
actually, after 6 months of going through that torture, never saying anything to anybody, took a rope and killed himself. We had three other top level CFOs, CEOs who killed themselves also. Now, this is extreme, hidden grief that they could have walked away. They were hostages, psychological hostages, leaving behind children, spouses, friends, organizations devastated by that loss. So, the point of this article, and it's received really wide recognition, is that we first have to be aware that we're grieving, and everybody grieves at some point. It's not a negative thing to grieve. We have to be aware of loss and its impact. Then we have to accept it. So some people say, oh, yeah, okay, I'm grieving, fine. But they don't accept it. They stay in a state of denial. And then comes action, doing something. Nick, I would like all your listeners to understand there is no loss too great that you can't get over it. And you can use the loss for an inspiration once you're through that grief. And that grief has to be able to inspire some positive outcome. You don't have to be a victim. And I often talk about Edith Edgar, whose parents were killed in Auschwitz. She was in Auschwitz. And she says the most important thing in her life, she's 92 years old, coming over here to IMD to teach 500 business executives
Wow.
about the
Wow.
power of choice. And she says the most powerful thing that taught her about the joy of life was those years in the prison and nearly dying there and losing her parents. And she said the reason that was so important was that she understood how valuable life is, and she wants to experience that to honor the people who did die. And you see, I learned this from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was a very dear friend of mine and teacher, that you don't help people who are passed on or died, and by suffering, you honor them by honoring their life, by coming to the full joy of life. And how many people do not experience the full joy of life or the full joy of work? And that's one of my missions as a leader, is to help teach leaders how to bring that fundamental joy of life to the surface, how to see life as an adventure, how to
Mm,
see the beauty of life. And if you're in a state of grief, and grief shows up with anger and sadness and fear and all kinds of states internally, you can't see the beauty of life.
hmm
And that's a
And,
choice. By the way, it's a choice. You don't
yeah.
have to be a hostage.
Yeah. Yeah. And for the people who have these types of experiences and who suffer a loss, they experience a trauma. And so
Yeah.
you hear, like, we hear more and more, and this is a good thing, that post traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, what is happening. I mean, I think we have a sense of what's happening with those people, but when you're applying this sort of lens to people who are suffering and maybe have received a diagnosis with PTSD, what is happening internally with them? And is it the fact that the process, overcoming the process for them is just a little bit difficult compared to somebody who doesn't have PTSD? Like, are they just caught by that grief and can't let it go?
That's one aspect. The other is it may go very deep into their identity. It may go very deep into what happens that they can't see a future. And I think the psychiatric and psychological community has done a great disservice by making grief a disease, making grief something that isn't natural. Here's what we know, Nick. Grief is a natural process in life, and you cannot grieve alone. You need a tribe, you need a family, you need a clan. And many times the post traumatic stress is related, sure, to all the impacts that's there, but they don't rewire the brain, reconcilibrate the brain to come back to see themselves and their identity, to get through that experience of grief, to really say goodbye. And we know
Mm-hmm.
you cannot say hello to life until you say goodbye. So post traumatic stress in that sense means that they have not successfully gone through the grief process.
Mm,
And it's not easy. I lost a son. I lost my 23-year-old son in 1992. So I can personally speak to what it means to be able to face the depth, the hell of grief of a loss of a child, and then come back to the full joy of life. And that
Mhm.
didn't happen with my own volition. It happened by me making a choice, but having a social system around me that supported me, secure
Mm.
bases. And that's what is often missing in people's lives. And when you talked about the complexity or the simplicity, we have too many people who do not have strong attachment systems from their youth so that they don't have this sense of a secure base in people and in life itself.
And COVID is really laying bare to these issues where we are on the one hand more alone and lonely because of certain restrictions that are being placed on our just sort of day-to-day experiences, and yet at the same time we're dealing with this grief. So as a result of that, we're dealing with loss and grief and anxiety and fear alone,
Yeah.
without loved ones. And
Exactly. The longing, I don't know if you feel it outside your family, the longing for a hug, just hugging somebody, just shaking hands. I mean, that was a the brain is hardwired for social functioning, and are having that seriously disrupted, and so people are grieving and missing little things. But then we turn it around and we look for how to turn that into an opportunity, into something that you learn. And see, this is one of the points we know from post-traumatic stress and from grief is you learn something. Learning. It's the heart of resilience. And resilience is the ability to bounce back. And wow, I'm sure you have heard stories, I'm sure your listeners have heard stories of people who have bounced back from the depths of hell in their loss and were able to recover the full joy of life. And we all know
absolutely.
victims. We all know victims who don't do that. And I
Yeah.
don't want to have this be a part of blaming. This is not about feeling guilty or blaming, but it's about saying we all have a choice and we
Mm,
need the right systems around us, the right secure bases, the right psychological safety to heal.
yeah. I'm always fascinated by these situations, and there's a handful of them in my own life and extended family members and friends, where, for instance, you have let's just hypothetical, two kids who are growing up in a tumultuous and uncertain environment, maybe domestic violence, maybe substance abuse, and one of the kids, both kids grow up into young adults and then into adults. One of them, by all accounts, ends up being a fully functioning adult and has a family in his or her own right, and then has a career and a job, and the other doesn't. And the other, ends up turning to substance abuse him or herself, and can never hold a job and never has a family. And so you see these such diverging paths from two people who share genetic material, who share the same environmental upbringing. What is it about you keep saying choice? What is it about the choice for the one child to choose path A and the other child to choose path B?
Boy, you are really asking the powerful questions. These go right to the heart of human functioning. And I think we overestimate the role of genetics. First of all,
Uh,
epigenetics is approving this. Our life experience, uh, uh, so many things around us can influence even the genes. I won't go into that now. But why are two people coming out differently? No two people have the same experience in their childhood. So it has to do with how the bonding occurred. Who were the secure bases? The key the key is finding the right secure base and letting that secure base truly influence you. It may not be a parent, it may not be a sibling, it may be a grandparent.
mm,
Or for those who don't have it, they turn to a gang member, or they turn to gangs, or they turn to drugs. That becomes a pathological attachment in which they seek refuge from their grief. And we ignore so many kids who are grieving in their families, who carry that for the rest of their life, and it spills over into leadership. One of the things we do in our high performance leadership program, and this is massively successful, we offer it 8 times a year. It's full in virtually every session. We've had to reduce the numbers because of COVID, but here's the transformative process. We use them as the only case study. We do not teach how to imitate another leader, but to find yourself. And how do we do that? We go back and look at the relationship with your mother, your father, your grandparents, the family, the griefs that you carry, and whether it's anger or fear or sadness, to reconcile those and rewire the brain. What we know is that there is a lot happening in which the reconstruction of the brain following post traumatic stress can rewire it in such a way that you can take the worst memory and rewire it into a positive memory.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah,
That high, so high. Let's jump into the high
I'm,
performance.
I'm giving
It's
you all
like,
kind of red meat there. I can
yeah,
see.
yeah. It's like Freud is in as if Freud were in a modern meeting room or boardroom. You know, you're bringing
Well,
these leaders and you're asking them to go back into their possibly their childhood and their
yes,
early attachment relationships with mother and father and primary caregivers and peers
yeah,
and friends.
yeah.
What is I mean, I must say it's not typical, but I can see why it's successful and why it works. What is the initial reaction when you have an executive or you have somebody and you're asking them these types of questions to probe into the deep recesses of their mind? And, what do they say at
Well,
first?
first of all, we created not in a threatening way. You're not going into the deep recesses to open up hell. No, you're going to find your strengths, and your
Yeah.
strengths are in your losses. Warren Bennis, my great mentor, who no longer is living, he always taught leaders develop character by developing and understanding their losses. Joe Biden, look at the losses this man had. His wife, a daughter, a son. He's gone through that grief. So this is the point. These are jewels. You don't wish them on anybody, but once they're there, they have to be transformed into character. So when we talk about this, we make it safe. We make them see the benefit. And then here's the thing. It's very different now with people coming to the program because over 80% come at a recommendation of someone who's been there before. Our
Mm,
website doesn't attract that many people at IMD. It is somebody who says, this is a program you got to go to.
mm,
This is a program to fully understand yourself. And once they get into that room and they hear the theory, and then they get in a coaching group, they get with an executive coach where they have the psychological safety to examine these things in confidential ways and in ways that are safe to explode or expose and bring
mm.
out in the open. So many blind spots. We talk about blind spots, Nick, of leaders who do stupid things at later points in their career, and boom, something takes them off on the wrong trajectory. I mean, they make the wrong decisions
Mhm,
somewhere
mhm.
along the line.
So my initial little joke, tongue in cheek comment about Freud in the meeting room. Um, it's interesting because there is this clinical element to it, and maybe well, I think that definitely should have space, and I think there should be room in our organizational and leadership lives for this type of work, and why I think society sees like clinical therapist or psychiatry psychologists as sort of existing over here for people who are suffering from mental illness, and then everything else non-clinical related, which is work and life and leadership over here, which is these two discrete categories or buckets, when in fact that's not the way that life works. You can have, they're very much overlapping. And so part of it sounds like, and correct me if this is a sort of characterization, but with high performance is you're blending those two parts together. It's clinically, but it's not clinical. Do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, every leader has to be a little bit of a psychologist. They have to
Yes.
understand motivation. And
Yes.
you're overemphasizing Freud. Freud made some big mistakes too.
Oh,
First of
yeah,
all,
yeah, yes,
blaming
yeah,
mothers for the problems. And this
yeah.
is not about blaming parents. It's about emotional availability. Here's the thing, Nick. If you see the high performing leaders who are really successful, they are emotionally available. Their hearts are not shut down. Their emotions are not shut down. So we help them walk through an experience, whatever it might be, could
Mm,
be past, could be recent, to open their heart again and be emotionally available. And this comes through in this model we're using of caring and daring. There are still leaders who believe if you're caring, you're a weak leader. Give me a break. And they don't know how to care. They don't see the importance of caring. And that doesn't mean you're not tough, you're not daring. And so it's this combination of caring and daring. Some of the most caring behavior a leader does is give really tough feedback. They deliver pain for people, and they do it in such a way that people say, "Thank you, give me more pain." These are the great leaders who are able to help other leaders develop and bring out the very best in
mm,
them. And ultimately, that spreads from organizational life, professional life, into personal life as well. How many
mm.
failed leadership behaviors occur in a family? Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So this emotional availability aspect is really interesting. As a leader, ideally you want to be emotionally available. You want to detect the cues of a direct report or an employee on your team who is suffering and struggling. How do you do that in a way while still protecting as the leader, your own emotional wellness? Like, is there a risk of sort of emotional burnout and exhaustion if you're extending yourself and allowing yourself that?
Absolutely. We saw a horrendous example of this in New York. This goes way back in, I think it was April. A very talented doctor, 40 years old, treating COVID patients who became exhausted, burnout, and she ended up committing suicide. Her father said how much she loved being a doctor. She couldn't separate or draw some
Mm,
boundary without a wall around her heart. So many people do not learn how to establish that boundary. It's sad. It can happen in medicine, in teachers, in leaders, etc. They burn out, exhaustion, carrying exhaustion. So you have to be able to replenish. What's the key? Secure bases. Do you have a system around you of psychological safety to be able to go and express, put words to what you're feeling inside? We know the brain researchers have identified one major point for emotional availability, and that is to put words to the pain that you feel. Put words to what you're feeling inside. Many people can't, and especially men. Men are handicapped in putting words to what's inside. That's why we know women tend to make better leaders than men. They bond better
mhm,
than men. Men often see caring as weak, but women have to learn how to deal with conflict, how to stand their ground, how to develop that side of their personality. Men have to often learn how to care again. And I get so upset when I hear to this day leaders who still say, if you're caring, you're not a good leader. You have to be tough. You have to just tell them what to do. Oh my
yeah, yeah.
goodness.
That's couldn't be more wrong. I do, and this is, I mean, there's fascinating parallels. I do work with a client partner, potential project, and their whole sort of new angle is on wise compassion, which is caring and daring. It's just a different set of labels and language to what you're explaining. Is it's the exact same psychological behavioral process. And we ran a big research study where we assessed leaders the level of wisdom, which is sort of the more assertive. This is the daring, and then compassion, which is the
Yeah,
caring. And what came through, this was about, I think, between 12 or 15,000 leaders global, was a clear gender effect. Was that
yeah,
across the board in almost, I think, every single country, which there was about 20, 25 countries, was that women were higher on the compassion dimension or the care dimension, and men were higher on the wisdom or the dare
yeah.
dimension. And it comes back to this like stereotype content model of Susan Fisk, which is that warmth and competence. Um, do you think that's changing in life and in modern organizations and companies where men are more comfortable expressing that sort of more nurturing, compassionate, caring side, and women vice versa on the other dimension?
Absolutely. We see more and more support for men learning to cry. We see more and more support for women learning to be tough negotiators, leading a country. Look at what's happened in Iceland, Finland, New Zealand. Let's go around the world of women who are doing very, very good, caring and daring. And so this is a whole model that we're trying to bring into the cultures of organizations, the caring, daring model, and being able to see this change culturally. And it is changing, and women are becoming more and more effective in dealing with conflict, standing their own ground without being negative, although they often are labeled as overbearing, or there's all kind of bias about that. But they have to have the courage to face that, and they need good mentors, men and women mentors, who help them through that process.
Mm-hmm.
Talent development is
Mm-hmm.
fundamental to leadership.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, final question, George, and I think you know what's coming because we've already sort of teed it up a little while back. But the BBB, the Big Behavioral Brainstorm. So, of all the problems in the world today, which one, if you had to select only one, would you say could stand to benefit from a psychological or a behavioral solution?
Wow. I would say again, psychological safety, how to build trust and how to find that trust. You don't build trust by not having it around you. So it's a reciprocity. So you find people you trust them, and you build that. And that takes away this whole survival mode. We are living in a world of danger,
Mm-hmm.
real danger from the pandemic, the climate, you name it. And so we need harbors of safety. We need secure bases. And so many people do not find good, secure bases. And so once that is solved, all the other problems will start falling into place. The ability to dialogue with people who have differences, taking the bonding to the environment really serious, taking poverty as something really, really serious, inclusion, and not uh, pushing people out and not misusing power. So I would say it's the ability to teach people to be emotionally available, caring, to create psychological safety. You don't create caring by hardness. You create caring by being daring and caring both at the same time.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Well,
Yeah.
George, this has been great. I think we covered all ground. I
Well, we
could keep
covered
you
a
for
lot of territory. Can I say one more thing?
Of
Yeah.
course you can. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
this article that's in McKinsey Quarterly is worth people reading. Whether you're
Hmm.
a leader or a layman, uh, it's worth reading. And the second thing is to go to my website, go to Twitter and LinkedIn, and there's all kinds of information there, videos, lectures, examples, because we really have to help people learn about what it is to be able to bond again, being able
Hmm.
to build secure bases. So anything that helps learning, I would encourage. So I just wanted to get that in there before we stop.
Yeah, thank you. And any of those resources, listeners, you can check out in the show notes, and I'll provide links and all the places you need to go to check out more information from George and the team, what the amazing work that they're doing. So
Can I ask you one quick question? What yeah, what was the most significant thing that you thought about today as a result of this dialogue?
that's a great question.
Thank you. I love great questions. By the way,
Yeah,
that's the key to good hostage negotiation.
yeah,
Asking
yeah,
questions.
absolutely, yeah. So I would say that I said it already, but maybe just to reiterate and put it in a bit of a different way, the idea that you can pull parallels from these extreme dangerous scenarios of being taken hostage and applying that emotional lens to leadership and organizational life today, and asking leaders those questions that you ask somebody at the same moment, who has a knife to your throat. You
Yeah.
know, that I think there's a lot of potential there, and there's a lot of power there for leaders and people to just ask themselves, am I taking myself hostage, psychological hostage.
Yeah.
And what can I do about it? So I think
No.
that's my big takeaway. Yeah.
Powerful. And what I really enjoyed about today is we really had a dialogue. And this is what people have to learn. Now, we don't have a difference of opinion, I'm sure, on some things, but but we have to be able to do this exact thing. Take an extreme person we don't agree with for
Yes.
political, religious, and ask some questions. Find out what's in their mind. Keep a bond, how to build a bond to an enemy and an adversary, and bring them into the arena of friendship.
Yeah, and there. I think that's a great. If I think when I have to pull a quote, I think that will be the quote that I pull from today's episode, because it's sorely needed, especially right now, to not other the other person or the outsider, to somehow find the common ground,
Yeah.
and to do that by
Find, and
discussing.
you can find the common ground virtually with anyone if you look for it,
Absolutely,
because we're all
yeah,
human. And
exactly.
I think along the way, if you're looking for another great quote, don't ever be a
Mm,
hostage to anyone, anything, or even to yourself.
perfect. Well, George, I think we'll have to have you back on the show maybe for season 3, and hopefully by then COVID will be over, and we'll help. At least listeners will have resolved and dealt with a lot of their own personal grief, and I think they'll find this really, really insightful and helpful. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Nick. It was a pleasure.
A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in this episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting and easy to apply sciencey stuff. Just head on over to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. The show is edited and co-produced by Laura Christine and Noelle Rain, and visual artwork, banners, and animated GIFs created by the talented Iris Deng of dengit.org. That's DENGIT.org. Definitely go and check it out. Lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcast fix. Quite a bit of work goes into these episodes, and a little love would go a long way. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.